Want to start with a list. 10% of your income for life, before taxes ideally, though they'll settle for after if you need them to. 2 years of your life, or 18 months if you're a woman, spent recruiting for the institution at your family's expense. You'll pay for your own mission. The church won't. Unpaid service every week in a job you didn't apply for, assigned by men you didn't elect, that you are spiritually obligated to accept. Your family history, your grandparents' names, your great-grandparents, everyone you can find going back as far as records exist. You'll research them, enter them into a database, and the church will own that database forever. Social separation from everyone who doesn't believe what you believe. No coffee, no tea, no alcohol. It sounds small until you realize what it actually does. It quietly shrinks your world to people who look and think and pray like you do. And your children. Starting around age 12, alone in a room with the man who is not their parent, being asked whether they've had sexual thoughts, whether they've touched themselves. Now, I want you to sit with one question. Who profits from all of that? Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally, because it isn't God. God doesn't need a hedge fund.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups, we're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem, digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hey, welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem. I'm Jess. If you have been listening to this show and thinking, okay, but I don't really have context for this, I didn't grow up in it, I don't really understand how Mormonism works, this episode is for you. And if you grew up inside it, well, this one's for you too. Because sometimes the hardest thing to see clearly is the thing you were standing in the middle of. So quick grounding if you're new. Mormonism is a lay-led church with no paid local clergy, a strong centralized leadership hierarchy, and unusually high expectations of member participation, financially, socially, and behaviorally. This is the bird's eye view of that system. And here's what I want you to know going in. The thesis of this episode isn't Mormonism is fake. The historical record makes a pretty compelling case for that conclusion, and we're going to touch some of it. But that's not actually the most interesting question. The more interesting question is, what does it mean that a system this elaborate, this effective, and this harmful was deliberately constructed? And why does it keep working? Because the LDS Church is not a uniquely weird American religion. It's one of the clearest, most well-documented examples of how high-control institutions are built, sustained, and protected. And once you see the machinery, you'll see it everywhere. So let's look at it. And the best place to start, the place where the design is the most visible, well, that's at the beginning. Because the founding of this church is not a story about a prophet. It's a story about a system being built. I need to tell you about Joseph Smith, not because I want to relitigate the founding of a religion. That's a whole separate episode. Honestly, it's a whole separate series. But because the origin story matters here, and this one is unusually well documented. Joseph Smith was born in 1805 in upstate New York. In the 1820s, before he founded the church, he was a treasure seeker. Literally, he charged people money to help them find buried treasure using a special rock. This is documented. He was also charged in 1826 in connection with these activities, something historians still debate in terms of technical classification, but the underlying practice itself is not in dispute. In 1827, he claimed he'd received golden plates from an angel, plates that contained a new scripture, the foundational text of Mormonism. And here's the part that gets glossed over. No one else was permitted to see these plates in their physical form. The 11 witnesses the church cites saw them either in vision or covered by a cloth. The actual translation happened with Joseph placing a seer stone, the same kind of rock he used to hunt treasure, into a hat, putting his face into the hat, and dictating. The golden plates weren't even in the room for most of it. No, I'm not editorializing here. This is what the church's own gospel topics essays acknowledge. They published them starting in 2013, quietly, on their website, written in the most carefully hedged possible language. They've never been taught in Sunday school. Now, the polygamy. We've all heard about it. Joseph Smith married somewhere between 30 and 40 women. The church's own essays confirm this. Among them, a 14-year-old named Helen Mar Kimball, and he married several women who were already married to living husbands. So that's called polyandry. And yes, it is as complicated as it sounds. He was doing all of this while publicly denying that polygamy existed in the church at all. And when women refused his proposals, he told several of them that an angel with a drawn sword had appeared to him and commanded them to accept or face divine consequences. Whew. Which is, to put it plainly, using God as a coercion mechanism. I'm not telling you this to be salacious, not to dunk on a dead man, but because this pattern, a charismatic leader building a power structure that served him sexually, financially, and socially, and then wrapping it in divine authority so it couldn't be questioned, well, that pattern didn't die with Joseph Smith. It became the template. And the men who came after him were very good students. So let's talk about what was actually built, because every structural feature of the modern LDS church serves the same basic function: concentrating power in a small group of men at the top and making that concentration feel like the will of God. Let's start with authority, or continuing revelation. So the prophet speaks for God. The prophet speaks for God, and God can change his mind. We know this because the church has changed its doctrine multiple times and called each change a new revelation. This means the institution is always right retroactively. Whatever the current prophet says is what God currently wants. Whatever the previous prophet said that turned out to be wrong was just, the best available revelation at the time. So members are encouraged to trust this process without questioning it. They have a word for this: faith promoting, which is really a warm way of saying, do not apply critical thinking here. Your doubt is a spiritual problem, not an intellectual one. The effect is elegant if you're trying to run a high control institution. Leadership becomes functionally immune to accountability. Mistakes become updated revelation. Harm becomes part of God's timing. I'll come back to this with receipts. But first, money. Because if you want to understand how this institution sustains itself, you have to understand what it extracts. Tithing. 10% of your income for life to remain a member in good standing, which in the LDS church means something very specific. Good standing gets you a temple recommend. And a temple recommend gets you access to temple ceremonies, which include your own endowment, your celestial marriage, the only kind the church recognizes as eternal, and your children's ordinances. If you can't get a temple recommend, you can't attend your own child's wedding inside the church's most sacred buildings. And that happens to real families regularly. Tithing compliance is one of the questions in the worthiness interview required to receive that recommend. So the financial extraction is not optional. It's the price of full participation in your own religion. Here's the part that should make you put down whatever you're holding. The church does not publish its finances. It's not required to. But we know some things. We know because in 2023, the SEC fined the church and its investment arm, which is a firm called Ensign Peak Advisors, $5 million for using 13 shell companies to hide the size of their investment portfolio from federal regulators for 20 years with the full knowledge and approval of senior church leadership. The portfolio they were hiding, by 2018, it had grown to approximately $32 billion in stocks alone. Independent analysis now puts the church's total estimated wealth, and that includes real estate, land, and other investments, at around $265 billion as of 2023. And their investment income now exceeds what they collect from member tithing. So this means the institution no longer needs the sacrifice that it still requires. The church's response to the SEC settlement was to say they regret mistakes made and that they consider this matter closed. They paid the $5 million fine with investment returns, not tithing money, but they were really clear about that. Think about that for a second. They were so concerned about the optics of their wealth that they hid it from the government for 2 decades. And then, when they got caught, they were careful to clarify that the fine didn't come from your tithing money, as if the $265 billion was the reassuring part. Missions. So tithing is one kind of extraction. The mission is another. And this one is harder to see as extraction at all because it's designed to feel like a gift you're giving. At 18 or 19 years old, before most people are developmentally equipped to critically evaluate much of anything, which, by the way, is not an accident, young Latter-day Saints are sent out on missions. 2 years for men, 18 months for women. And it's paid for by the missionary and their family. They go in pairs, always monitored by a companion. Controlled diet, no social media, no unsupervised contact with anyone outside the mission structure, weekly letters home, but no real privacy. And their entire job is to sell door to door, the institution that shaped them since birth, to people who didn't ask to be approached. But the mission isn't just about recruitment. It's about the missionary. When you spend 2 years sacrificing for something, your time, your social life, your cognitive independence, your family's money, you become deeply, personally invested in it being true. The sunk cost isn't just financial, it's existential. Walking away from the church after a mission means confronting the possibility that you gave 2 years of your life to something that wasn't real. Most people don't do that willingly. The mission is, among other things, a mechanism for manufacturing that investment. The church currently has over 100,000 missionaries deployed worldwide. That is a lot of free labor, and every one of them paid for the privilege. Temple secrecy. Now, the temple is where the most sacred ceremonies happen: endowments, marriages, proxy baptisms for the dead, which we'll get to. And this is secret, not sacred secret in the way that, say, your prayer life is private. Members take oaths inside the temple and are not supposed to disclose what happens there to anyone outside. Historically, those oaths included pantomimed penalties for revealing the ceremonies, gestures imitating having to cut your throat, your body dismembered. Those penalties were quietly removed in 1990 after they became publicly known. No explanation was given. The ceremonies have been changed multiple times. The most recent significant changes removed language that many members found troubling, including a covenant where women promised to hearken to their husbands as their husbands hearkened to God. Gone now. Also without explanation. Here's what temple secrecy actually does functionally. It creates a powerful in-group experience. You have been initiated. You have received something that others have not. You have made covenants. That emotional and psychological investment, that feeling of having been given something precious and rare, well, that makes the institution harder to leave. You're not just leaving a church. You're walking away from your own covenants. secret information is also, not coincidentally, information that is very hard to think critically about. You can't fact check something you're not supposed to discuss. Now, social isolation. The word of wisdom is the LDS health code. No coffee, no tea, no alcohol, no tobacco. It was originally framed as a suggestion. There's some historical irony there, but it is now a requirement for temple worthiness. On the surface, you might think, okay, well, that's just a lifestyle choice. And for individual members, sure. But zoom out and look at what it does structurally. It creates a visible daily marker of belonging and separation. Every time you decline a glass of wine at a work dinner, every time you order water when everyone else is having coffee, you are performing your identity as a member. You are marking yourself as different from the people around you. And then add to that the informal but real counsel, especially for children, to be careful about close friendships with non-members. Add the sheer volume of church activity. Sunday services, weekday youth programs, leadership meetings, service assignments, temple trips. The church doesn't just ask for your Sunday mornings, it asks for significant chunks of your entire week. The accumulative effect is that your entire social world becomes the church. Your friends are church members. Your neighbors often are church members. Your family structure is organized around the church. Your social safety net, well, it's the church, which means that leaving doesn't just cost you your religion. It costs you your community, your family relationships, your neighborhood, sometimes your marriage, your identity. The church doesn't have to threaten you into staying. It just has to make leaving extraordinarily expensive. Now, genealogy. This one is my personal favorite in the best, darkest way. Members are asked to research their family history, going back as far as records allow, and then submit their ancestors' names to the church for proxy baptism. The doctrine is that the dead can choose to accept or reject their posthumous Mormon baptism, so you're not forcing anyone into anything. You're just giving grandma the option. The result of this theologically motivated labor is FamilySearch, the LDS Church's genealogy database operated through the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. It is, without question, one of the largest genealogical databases in the world. And as of now, it contains over 20 billion searchable records and images. By 2014, it was 32 times the size of the Library of Congress, and it adds the equivalent of another Library of Congress every single year. It was built almost entirely by volunteers who believed they were doing sacred work for their dead ancestors. Now, FamilySearch is free to use and genuinely useful. This isn't a scam in the traditional sense, but the institution owns the database, controls access to certain records, and has licensing and research partnerships with organizations, including Ancestry.com. So members generating all of that data believed they were engaged in eternal salvation, but the institution got an infrastructure that would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build any other way. Not about individual intent, about structural outcome, about who benefits. So we have the structure. Now let's talk about how the institution protects itself when the structure starts to crack. I want to come back to continuing revelation now because I told you we'd have receipts, and I'm a woman of my word. The LDS Church has a mechanism for changing its doctrine when the cost of the old doctrine becomes too high. It's called revelation, and it is remarkably consistent in when it shows up. We'll start with polygamy in 1890. The church practiced polygamy openly from the 1850s. The federal government spent decades trying to stop it. They passed legislation, prosecuted members, seized church property. And Utah's application for statehood was repeatedly rejected because of polygamy. In 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued what is now called the Manifesto. It ended polygamy. It was presented as a revelation, and Utah achieved statehood 6 years later. It's worth noting, polygamy continued in secret among some church leadership for years after this manifesto. And the church's own essays now acknowledge that the original practice was revelatory, the end of it was revelatory, and the ongoing secret practice after the end of it is, well, something they'd prefer to not dwell on. From the Brigham Young era through 1978, Black men were barred from the priesthood. This means they were barred from the most meaningful participation in the church, from temple ceremonies, from leading congregations. The theological justification shifted over the decades, and it was wrong and racist regardless of justification. The ban ended in 1978. It's now called Official Declaration 2, and it is described as a revelation received by Church President Spencer W. Kimball. Here's what the church's own Gospel Topics essay on this subject says. The original ban had, and I'm quoting, no basis in the revelations or instructions of Joseph Smith. This means the ban itself was never actually revelation. God's position on the full humanity of Black members changed, or rather, the men speaking for God finally caught up right around the time the church was aggressively expanding into Brazil and West Africa, where a whites-only priesthood was a serious logistical and PR obstacle. Revelation is remarkably sensitive to institutional pressure. I'm just noting that. In November 2015, the church quietly updated its handbook. Same-sex married couples were classified as apostates. Their children were barred from baby blessings, baptism, and most church ordinances until they turned 18, at which point they could apply for membership if they disavowed their parents' relationship and no longer lived with them. This was called revelation. Apostle Russell M. Nelson, who would later become church president, confirmed it publicly. Sacred process, Lord's will. People resigned from the church in large numbers. LGBTQ members and their families were devastated. Suicides were documented in connection with this policy. Mental health organizations that work with Mormon communities were issuing crisis guidance to therapists about what to watch for. 41 months later, in April 2019, the policy was reversed. Quietly. Announced to leadership before conference, but not during it. No mention from the pulpit to the general membership. No acknowledgement of the harm caused. No apology. The reversal was also called revelation. The church, in its official statement, said they knew that this policy created concern and confusion for some and heartache for others. Heartache for others. That's the language they chose. Here is the pattern stated plainly. The church changes its doctrine when the PR cost of one of the old doctrine becomes too high. The change is called revelation. The harm caused by the old doctrine is not apologized for because an apology would require acknowledging that the old revelation was wrong, and wrong revelations are a problem for an institution whose entire authority rests on the claim that the prophet speaks for God. So they don't apologize. They just update their instructions and call it God. Here is what the LDS Church is actually optimized for. It is not optimized for spiritual growth or honest inquiry or individual flourishing, though it produces those things in some members some of the time as a side effect. It is optimized for member retention, financial extraction, institutional protection, and the concentration of authority in a small group of men who are accountable to no one but each other. Every structural feature we just walked through, tithing, missions, temple secrecy, social isolation, revelation by fiat, it serves those functions, not coincidentally, by design. And this is not a uniquely Mormon story. You've seen this before. Evangelical megachurches, the same authority structures, the same financial extraction, the same social isolation, the same revelation by charisma, where the pastor's word carries divine weight and questioning it is a spiritual failing. MLMs. Oof, this one is not coincidental. Utah has more multi-level marketing companies per capita than any other state in the country. Direct sales is the second largest industry in Utah behind tourism. Researchers and the industry's own executives attributed this directly to LDS culture. The structural parallels are almost too clean. Belonging is contingent on performance. Financial investment creates sunk cost loyalty. Recruitment is framed as spiritual duty, and the hierarchy looks like a pyramid because it is one. Authoritarian political movements. The leader's word overrides evidence. Questioning is disloyalty. Belonging is conditional on compliance. Leaving costs you your community, your identity, sometimes your family. And if you've been paying attention to the last decade of American politics, you know what that looks like from the inside. Abusive family systems. The patriarch's authority is absolute. Your instincts and objections are reframed as spiritual failure or disloyalty. Leaving costs you everything. The mechanism is the same across all of these. The LDS Church just built an unusually clean, unusually well-funded, unusually well-documented version of it, which is why it's useful to study, not just for ex-Mormons, for anyone who has ever been inside a system that asked them to make someone else's authority feel like their own spiritual obligation. If you were raised in the church and something felt wrong but you couldn't name it, you were being managed. If you had an instinct to question and were told that instinct was Satan or spiritual weakness or pride, your instinct was right. If you complied with something that hurt you because someone with priesthood authority told you it was God's will, that was not your failure. That was the system working exactly as it was designed. And if you've never been a Mormon, but you're listening to this and something is snagging on a memory, some other institution, some other authority structure, some other moment when your discomfort was reframed as the problem, hold on to that. Because once you see the machinery, you'll see it everywhere. And that is a genuinely useful thing to walk away with. Thank you for being here. If this episode was useful to you, if you found yourself forwarding it to someone in your life who keeps asking what the big deal is, well, that's exactly what it was made for. You can find us on Instagram at postmormon postmortem or on the web at postmormonpostmortem.com. Leave us a review if you're so inclined. It genuinely helps. We've got more bonus episodes coming up, and they're going to go even deeper on some of these threads on the revelation machine and how it operates in real time, and a full episode on why none of this is uniquely Mormon, because it matters beyond this community. Until then, everyone listening, I want you to know, whether you left last week or last decade, you belong here. No temple recommend required. And hey, sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.